we live our lives and the way that we interact with each other, the way that we operate as a congregation, the way that we talk, the way that we act, the way that we look to people around us. He gets into the details of all of the particulars. I say all, not every single thing there is to know about how the gospel should change your life, but he gets into a lot of it. He talks about how we talk and how we act. He talks about our relationships. At the end of the book, he's going to talk about the spiritual warfare we fight on a regular basis. And so in this last section of the book, which is where we find ourselves today, he's getting into how this gospel story changes our lives. Last week we looked at, starting in verse 17 of chapter 4, we started there and started looking at this admonition to take off the old self and put on a new self. Like a dirty pair of clothes, you take it off and put on a clean pair. And he uses that language down in verse 22. Well, I'll tell you what, let's just read a little bit starting in verse 17 to kind of get back into the mindset of this section. In verse 17 of chapter 4, Paul says, "So this I say and affirm together with the Lord, that you walk no longer as the Gentiles also walk, in the futility of their mind, being darkened in their understanding, excluded from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the hardness of their heart. And they, having become calloused, have given themselves over to sensuality for the practice of every kind of impurity with greediness." In verse 20 he says, "But you did not learn Christ in this way. If indeed you've heard Him and have been taught in Him, just as truth is in Jesus, that in reference to your former manner of life, you lay aside that old self." That old self he just described in those opening verses, the one that's darkened, the one that was excluded, the one that was ignorant and hardened in the heart, the one that was calloused. That's the old self. And in verse 22 he says, "In reference to that former manner of life, lay aside the old self, which is being corrupted in accordance with the lust of deceit, and that you be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and put on the new self, which is in the likeness of God, and has been created in righteousness and holiness of the truth." And so this little section, verse 17 to 24, really kind of lays a foundation for what's to come in the next paragraphs, all the way into chapter 5 and almost all the way into chapter 6. He's going to talk about how taking off this old man and putting on a new man, what does that actually look like in particulars, in the way we talk, in the way that we act, in our relationships that we have. What does that really look like? And so last week we looked at verse 17 all the way down through chapter 5, verse 2. That's all kind of one big section that works together. And in verse 25, he said, in reference to this old man, he was falsehood. And so in verse 25, he says, "Therefore, laying aside falsehood, now speak the truth, each one of you, with his neighbor." So lay aside lying and take up truth-telling. In verse 26, he said, "Be angry, yet do not sin, and do not let the sun go down on your anger, and do not give the devil an opportunity." He talked about how the old man, he kind of pictures this old man with somebody who is angry, and he holds on to things, he holds grudges, he never makes peace. But this new man, he says it's not wrong to be angry, but don't let the sun go down on your anger. Be a person who seeks to make peace, who seeks to mend what's been damaged, so that the devil doesn't have an opportunity. In verse 28, he says, "He who steals must steal no longer, but rather he must labor, performing with his own hands what is good, so that he'll have something to share." So the old man would steal and take things, but the new man works and is generous with what he earns through his work. In verse 29, he says, "Let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, but only such a word that is good for edification, according to the need of the moment." We talked about that one for quite a bit last week. This idea of unwholesome words, sometimes we think of that just in terms of foul language and cuss words. I don't think it's limited to that. You can say a lot of mean things with your words and never say a cuss word in your life. You can tear people apart with your words. And I think that's what he's talking about, because the opposite is edification, building up with your words. And so he says this old man would tear people down with his words, but when you put on the new man, now you build people up. And he even says in verse 29, "Let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, but only such a word as is good for edification, according to the need of the moment." There's going to be moments where you see opportunities to build people up with your words. There's going to be moments you see opportunities to tear people down with your words. When you see those moments, he says the new man takes advantage of edification, and he chooses to build up with his words instead of tear people down. In verse 31, he says, "Let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and slander be put away from you, along with all malice, and be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving each other, just as God in Christ also has forgiven you." And then in chapter 5, verse 1 and 2, they kind of go with this previous section, and he gets down to the core of really what it means to do this. He says, "Therefore be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love, just as Christ also loved you and gave himself up for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God as a fragrant aroma." Last week we kind of finished off right there, and we looked at a passage in Romans where it describes how while we were sinners, Christ died for us. Not while we were lovable and likable and enjoyable and pleasant, Christ died for us. No, while we were sinners, while we were filthy, while we were doing things we should not have been doing, Christ died for us. And there's no greater picture of love. In fact, in that passage in Romans 5, Paul even says, one would hardly die for a good and righteous man, but Christ died for filthy sinners like us. That is a great picture of love. And Paul says if we're going to be this new humanity that Christ died, that this gospel has drawn us into, if we're going to put on this new person, we've got to learn how to be imitators of that kind of love. And that gets to the heart of all of this. That's a brief summary of last week's class. Any comments, questions, thoughts about any of that? All right, let's move into chapter 5, verse 3. Because here he's going to kind of transition to a different little section, but also he's going to be talking in the same lane of things, of how this gospel story and how taking off this old man and putting on a new man, how it should really impact the way that we live. And he's going to do it with three trios of things that we should not do, and then one trio of things that we should do. The first one, first of all, let's just read verse 3 down through verse 14, if you'll follow along with me. Chapter 5, verse 3 through 14. He says, "But immorality or any impurity or greed must not even be named among you, as is proper among saints. And there must be no filthiness or silly talk or coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather the giving of thanks. For this you know with certainty, that no immoral or impure person or covetous man who is an idolater has an inheritance in the kingdom of God, in the kingdom of Christ and God. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. Therefore, do not be partakers with them. For you were formerly darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. For the fruit of the light consists in all goodness and righteousness and truth, trying to learn what is pleasing to the Lord. Do not participate in the unfruitful deeds of darkness, but instead expose them. For it is disgraceful even to speak of the things which are done by them in secret. But all things become visible when they're exposed by the light. For everything that becomes visible is light. For this reason it says, 'Awake, sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you.'" That's this section we're going to look at this morning. We may get into the next section if we have time, but notice how he starts in verse 3. He gives a trio of things that he says must not even be named among you. What are those three things? What's this first trio? Sexual sin, impurity, and greed. So sex, filthiness, and money. You talk about some of the core things that are going to trip Christians up. There it is. Sex, filthiness, and money. And he says these things ought to have no place among God's people. This sexual sin, impurity, greed, these difficult things that Christians are going to have to deal with. Sexual sin, filthiness, impurity, that idea of moral corruption. The idea that the world has influenced you to a point where the things that you do, the way that you act, the way that you think has been corrupted. He says that ought to not be named. And then greed, the desire for things that you may not even need to have. The desire for more and more and more, this constant longing for things. He says these things ought not to be named among you, as is proper among the saints. The next trio he gives is in verse 4. What does he say there? What is it? What's in verse 4? What's the filthiness, silly talk, and what else? Crude joking, coarse jesting. We'll talk about some of these words for a second. That first one was filthiness. I don't like that translation of it. Really, the word means to be brought to shame, something that brings you shame. Shamefulness is kind of the idea of that. That doing things that bring you shame, shameful acts is kind of the idea of that. We've all done things that we look back and we say, "Man, I'm kind of ashamed that I did that." Things that even sometimes we'll do things in certain crowds that we wouldn't do in front of other people because we know it would bring us shame. Those are the kinds of acts he's talking about. Shameful acts, things that bring shame to you, that darken you. That's the first word. Then he says, the New American Standard says silly talk. What other translations say? Foolish talk. Foolish is probably a better one. Silly talk, I think, gets to the heart of what kids do, but foolish talk gets a little bit more to the heart of it. That word foolish has kind of two dual backgrounds. First of all, it has a Greek background, which kind of gets to the idea of being tasteless. Tasteless talk, like unsalted. You eat unsalted food, it's tasteless, kind of gross. And he says, our talk can be tasteless. It's not bringing any good thing to the world. It's not bringing any benefit. It's tasteless. But then there's the Hebrew background of it, of folly. You think about foolishness in the book of Proverbs, how it's contrasted with wisdom. All through the book of Proverbs, the foolish man does this and the wise man does this, or folly says this and wisdom says this. And so he says that man of folly, that man of foolishness talks a certain way, and he thinks a certain way, and his words communicate a certain thing. That's what he's talking about here. This idea of tasteless, foolish talk that it characterizes people of foolishness, characterizes people of folly that are in a wrong way of life, that aren't really living. You look at the world, there's a certain way that they talk about things, isn't there? You look at the way that people act out in the world that aren't Christians, that don't come from a Christian background. A lot of times they have a certain language, a certain way that they speak about things, a certain outlook on life. This is what he's talking about, that foolish way of thinking. It's not enlightened by Christ. It's not enlightened by our purpose in the world. And so he says that ought to have no place among God's people, this tasteless, foolish thinking. And then the last one, what does he say? Coarse jesting. Boy, that's a fun phrase, isn't it? What do other translations say? Vulgar joking. That gets to the heart of it right there, doesn't it? Indecent humor is kind of the idea. Indecent humor, vulgar joking. Locker room talk, things that the guys sit around and joke about and laugh about and crack jokes about that's probably a little bit too far, but they joke about it anyways. I can't speak for ladies. I'm not a lady, but I know guys do that. They get in certain circles and they talk a certain way and they think about certain things and they crack jokes like that, and it's indecent. And he says that kind of indecent humor, that type of coarse jesting, vulgar humor. He says, notice the phrase he uses in verse 4. He says, which is not fitting. This is not fitting for God's people. That kind of language, this kind of shameful talk, this kind of language that we use, the way we talk about life, the way that we joke about things, he says that's not fitting for the people of God, for the people of Christ. And then the third trio he gives is in verse 5. What does he say? Immoral, sexually immoral. It's the same word as up here, sexual sin. Greedy. What else? Impure. It's the same list from the first one, isn't it? You think Paul was concerned about that? If he said it twice, it seems to be a pretty big deal. And I imagine the people of Ephesus, sorry, I know everybody over here can see, and then everybody over here can see. Somewhat, maybe. I wrote it pretty low. Now we can see. I saw y'all looking over there, so... But these things here are just the three trios that he gives. He gives these trios of things that should not be found among God's people. Sexual sin, impurity, this idea of filthiness, greed, shameful acts, foolish talk, indecent humor, sexual sin, impurity, greed. He says these things have no place among God's people. And notice the language he uses in verse 3. He said, "But immorality, impurity, and greed must not even be named among you, as is proper among saints." In verse 4, he says, "There must be no filthiness, silly talk, or coarse jesting, which are not fitting among God's people." Those things don't fit among God's people. And then in verse 5, he says, "For this you know with certainty, that no immoral or impure person or covetous man who is an idolater has an inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God." These kinds of people, he says, they don't have their inheritance here. This is that old man that was set aside. This is that person that you walked away from. This is the person that ought to have been crucified with Christ, to borrow Paul's language from Galatians. That person exists no more. And he says that those kinds of things ought not to be named among God's people. When they look at us and they look at our lives, they should not describe us with things like this. They should not describe us as people who are involved in sexual sin. They shouldn't describe us as people who are involved in impure things. They shouldn't describe us as greedy people, always trying to get more and more and more. Materialism, the longing for more money, things like that. Shameful acts, things that bring us shame. Foolish talking about the way the world talks, this tasteless language, indecent humor, all of these things. He says this has no place among God's people, and so he gives these trios, and he's trying to show them, listen, this is the old man that needs to be set aside. This is the man that has no place among us anymore. And in verse 6, notice how he continues his thought. He's going to give. Let me count them up here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 commands here in regard to this way of life. Notice in verse 6, he says, what's the first command he gives them in verse 6? Let no one deceive you. How would somebody try to deceive them? What does he mean when he says that? Why would he say that following, hey, listen, you've lived, listen, all of these things should not be named among God's people. And then he comes on and says, let no one deceive you with empty words. Why do you think he would say that following this list of things? Yeah. Don't let people tell you these things are okay. Don't let people try to convince you that this is the way of life you ought to be in. Do you think that maybe they had some outside influence on their life? We probably know a little bit about what that's like. Of people out there who say, "Oh, you're worried about all this stuff, and it's not a big deal. You're so worried about getting everything right and being morally upright and doing the right thing all the time. Like these things aren't a big deal. It's not going to be a big deal if you go down to the bar and get drunk for one night. It's not going to be a big deal if you go out and do this shameful act with your friends. It's not that big of a deal if you talk this certain way." Amanda?
Well, you said that this book would have been mostly to Gentiles. The Hebrews already knew that Eve was deceived by words, by Satan at the beginning. The Gentiles probably wouldn't have had that context of how it's so easy to be led into sin. And usually it's by the people closest to you just being like, hey, let's go do this, or hey, let's go talk about this. The Gentiles probably didn't have that kind of frame of reference.
That's right. You're exactly right. And even the somewhat of moral code they had came from Greek philosophy. It came from a place that sought to do good things, but not from a godly basis, not from that kind of basis. And even sometimes in trying to do those good things, they were doing bad things. And so their moral code, you're right, was a little bit skewed from what it should have been, especially when you start thinking about idolatry and all of the sexual sin that went into idolatry. Idol prostitutes in the temples and the things that went into a lot of those things. And so he says, listen, don't let people trick you into thinking that's the way of life you ought to be in. That the life of sexual sin and impurity and greed and this language, all of these corrupt ways of using your tongue, don't let them convince you that that's the way you ought to be living. And so Paul says, let no one deceive you with empty words. And then he says in verse 6, for because of these things, the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. Have we seen that phrase in this book before? Do you remember where? If you can find it, boy, you are going to be my favorite student. Anybody remember where we saw that phrase, sons of disobedience? Chapter 2, Verse 2. Yeah. Did you look at a cross-reference, you cheater? That's okay. I'm just kidding. That's a great practice. No, I'm just kidding. You're not a cheater. Hey, that's what they're there for. So in chapter 2, verse 2, if you notice chapter 2, verse 1, kind of this section, he's talking about how you've been brought from death to life in Christ. In chapter 2, verse 1, he says, "And you were dead in your trespasses and sins, in which you formerly walked, according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, of the spirit that is now working in" who? The sons of disobedience. Paul described this former way of life that was skewed by the ways of the world. The ways of the world told them how to live. Also, the prince of the power of the air, that interesting description of the satanic powers, the evil powers of the world. He says, you were influenced by those powers and this inward spirit of disobedience. This group of people who were influenced by the world, who were influenced by Satan, who were disobedient, Paul makes a reference to them back here in chapter 5. He says, "Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things the wrath of God comes upon those sons of disobedience." Those same people who are influenced by the world. He's saying, don't let them trick you into living that same way again. You noticed in chapter 2, he said, you formerly walked that way. You used to live that way of life. I don't know about all of you, but I know coming out of my background where I came from, it was very easy for my friends to look at me and the life change that we had made, and we had become Christians. We had stopped drinking. We stopped doing a lot of things. And it was easy for them to look at me and say, hey, come over this weekend. We're doing this, and we're having this big old party, and we're doing this and that, and there's going to be this there, and there's going to be this. And that was, just up front, that was tempting. As a new Christian coming out of that way of life, that was a fun way of life. Even though it was problematic, sin is fun. Sin, if it wasn't attractive, we wouldn't sin. But it was attractive to look back at that life and to say, man, that sounds like a good time. And Paul's warning to people that find themselves there is, let no one deceive you with empty words, telling you that way of life is where you need to be. Go ahead. That's right, yeah. And we live in a world full of people who call evil good. I've walked in the place where I called evil good and good evil. I've lived there, and many of us have lived in that place where we've been in those shoes. And he says, don't let that way of life draw you back into it. Don't let those people, those sons of disobedience who are following the ways of the world, who are following Satan, don't let them draw you back in to that way of life. In verse 7, he gives another command. What is it? Don't be partakers with them. What does it mean to be a partaker? Partners? Participant? What is it?
1 Timothy 5:22 says, "Don't lay hands on anyone hastily, nor share in other people's sin. Keep yourself pure."
That idea of sharing in other people's sins. Yeah, and that's what that word means, to be a partaker, to be a participant, to be a sharer in these people's business. It's interesting. The Lord's Supper is described as a partaking, a sharing. That's a godly thing that we share in, that we participate in as a community. In contrast, we can participate with the things out there. We can participate with this darkness, with the evil things. And Paul says, do not be partakers with them. Who is the them? Those sons of disobedience, those people who are following the ways of the world, living how they want to live. He says, don't be partakers with them. In verse 8, for you were formerly darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. I gave it away, but verse 8, the next command is walk as children of light. We're going to talk about these words in just a second. So first of all, he says in verse 8, you were formerly darkness. This is what we've been looking at, this idea of these things. These are darkness. These are the way that is described as darkness. And he tells us, don't let people deceive you into that darkness. Turn to chapter 6 really quick. And I'm kind of going off script here because I think it says something. Chapter 6, verse 12. And notice what it says here. And we're going to talk about this in detail at the end of this class. But in chapter 6, verse 12, it says, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of what? darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness, even in the heavenly places. Paul says, listen, the battle we're fighting is not a physical battle. We're not to let those people out there deceive us, true. But our war is not with those people. It's with the spiritual influences that have influenced them to live a certain way. And he says that our war is with these spiritual forces of darkness. And he says in chapter 5, verse 8, you formerly were of that darkness. You were influenced by those spiritual forces. You were captivated by the wickedness. And he says, you formerly were in that, but now you are what? He says, now you are light in the Lord. You are no longer darkness, but you are light. You've been brought out of darkness and into light. The Bible uses that language through and through to describe what this process of becoming a Christian. You've been brought out of darkness and into His marvelous light, is what Peter says. John talks about it a lot. And he says, you've been brought out of darkness and into light, therefore walk as children of light. Actually live your life as if you are children of light, not children of darkness. He says, if you've been brought out of darkness into light, and you're going to claim that, and you're going to own that, then live like it. Live as children of the light. And he goes on in verse 9, and he says, for the fruit of the light consists of all goodness and righteousness and truth. Now, what does that phrase, the fruit of the light, sound like? Does that sound like another phrase we hear somewhere? Fruit of the Spirit. I think it's the same concept. This Paul in Ephesians is using these broader terms of darkness and light, but he's saying, listen, I want you to walk as children of light, and here's what the fruit of that light looks like. Here's the fruit of that way of life, and what does he say it is? Goodness, righteousness, and truth. So you've got these two opposite ends of the spectrum, and he gives three trios there to talk about the darkness and one here to talk about the light. What was it? Goodness. What else? Righteousness and truth. He says, don't let this characterize your life. Don't let those other three trios of sexual sin and impurity and greed and shameful talk, don't let that characterize your life, but walk as children of light, children of goodness. What does goodness mean? That's good. Yeah, that's as simple as it gets. Goodness, it means you're good. You are characterized by goodness. To me, there is no greater description of a person than goodness. You think about somebody, you think, man, that is a good man. That is a good person. The people that you can think of like that's how Christians ought to be characterized. That's how children of light ought to be characterized. People of goodness, people of righteousness. There's two kind of veins of righteousness. One is the idea of justice. You're going to be somebody who upholds justice, who is doing the right thing, who is calling out the wrong things. But it also means right living. There's kind of two avenues of righteousness. One is justice, and one is characterized by the way that you live. But both of those are true of what we should be as children of light. We should be characterized by goodness, by righteousness and justice, and then by truth. Not by falsehood, not by lying, not by things that are deceptive, but by truth. This is the way. This is what he calls the fruit of the light. And then in verse 10 here in chapter 5, he says, trying to learn what is pleasing to the Lord. What other translations say that? Finding out what is pleasing to the Lord. What else? Discerning what is pleasing to the Lord. Some translations say to prove. And there's, I think the King James may say prove, maybe others, I don't know. Does anybody have a translation that says to prove? I don't know, I know some do. But the reason they use that word is because that word trying or discerning, trying to find out, that trying to learn, trying to discern, that word means it's almost a trial by error word. It means to try something so that you can prove its worthiness. If you turn to 1 Peter chapter 1, Peter gives a great demonstration of what that word really means. And I'll tell you why I'm pointing that out in just a second. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 7. The word in this verse, proof, is what that same Greek word. Notice what he says here. 1 Peter 1 verse 7. He says, let me start in verse 6. He says, in this you greatly rejoice, even though now for a little while, if necessary, you've been distressed by various trials, so that the proof of your faith, being more precious than gold which is perishable, even though tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor, the revelation of Jesus Christ. He describes a faith that has been tried and tested and proven true. That's what he's describing there. That's what this word means. When he says in Ephesians 5, verse 10, trying to discern, trying to learn, it's that word that means to test something until it's proven true. I find it interesting that he uses that word because he could have just said, do what is pleasing to the Lord. But he didn't. He said, test and prove what is good and valuable and true. That indicates to me that this life is not a one and done and you've got it all figured out kind of thing. But it's a trial. It's a way of life where you're constantly discerning and you're looking for ways to implement goodness and righteousness and truth. And it doesn't mean you're always going to get it right. It doesn't mean you're always going to have it perfectly. There's going to be times where you have this indecent humor and shameful acts and sexual sin, and those things are going to creep their way in. But it's having the discernment to try these things and to prove what is true and to turn to what is good and faithful. It describes this trial process. I find it interesting that he uses that word. Jack?
Working.
Yeah, it's this idea of crafting these skills. And if you know anything about crafting a skill, if you've ever, whatever your hobbies are, I enjoy playing golf, and I'm not very good at it, and it takes a lot of work. But you get up there and you try to hit the ball, and it goes the wrong direction. It takes a lot of crafting and working on your swing and figuring out how you're going to hit this ball straight, and it takes a lot of practice. That's what this idea is. It's trial by fire. You're putting things to the test and finding what is good and true and righteous towards the will of God. Mark, go ahead.
To Romans 12:2, we've heard it a bunch of times, but it applies to this scripture you were reading up. It says, "Do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is good and acceptable and perfect."
And I'd be willing to bet that's probably the same word, that idea of that you may prove what is good and acceptable. I'd be willing to bet that's probably the same idea there. But you notice here in Ephesians 5, verse 10, he says, trying to discern, that proving, that trial by fire process, trying to discern what is pleasing to the Lord. That's what this life is all about. We're working through this process of trying in our day-to-day lives to look at situations we find ourselves in, to look at things that we've done that maybe were wrong, look at things we've done that were right, to just examine our lives from a bird's eye view and say, okay, what is pleasing to the Lord? What is He calling me towards? What is the life that He wants me to live? And where have I strayed from that? Where have I gotten off track, and where can I get back on track? What do the Scriptures teach me about living this new humanity life? Go ahead.
It kind of sounds like a challenge, like make a choice and see what happens, because nothing good comes from any of those things. Bliss and darkness, and if you're going to choose that,
You're absolutely right.
You're going to choose goodness and righteousness and truth. Try it.
And in Hebrews chapter 11. When he was describing the people of faith, he described when Moses was in Egypt, he called the sins that he partook of there the passing pleasures of sin. They were pleasures, but they were passing and fading, and then came Monday morning, and it was difficult, and it was hard, and there were challenges on the other side. And so, it's this challenge that walk as children of light. Don't participate with them. Don't let them deceive you, but through your life, try to discern the path that God has paved for you. Try to discern this goodness and righteousness and truth, and how you can move your life in every decision you make and every conversation you have towards that light. That's what Paul is looking at here. In verse 11, he gives another command. What is it? What is it? Yeah, don't take part. Don't participate. Don't share in it. That same idea as this one. Don't be a partaker, but rather what? But expose. He says, do not participate in the unfruitful deeds of darkness. That gets to that idea of what you were just saying about that life that produces nothing good. It's unfruitful. And he says, do not participate in those unfruitful deeds of darkness, but instead do what? Expose them. Now, what does light do in darkness? It exposes things. A lot of times we look at that idea of expose, and we think we have to run around, and every time we see somebody do something wrong, we yell at the top of our lungs and holler at them and point. There's a place for calling things out verbally and saying things, but a lot of times what you're going to find is just being the light, just living as goodness and righteousness and truth is enough to expose darkness. People are going to see it. I'll give you an example. In our families, we don't come from Christian homes. And so every time we go home, we can see them hiding the liquor in the cabinets, and we can see them, watching the way they talk, and they'll slip up and say something, and they'll say, "Oh, sorry, Pastor," you know how people get when they're around Christians sometimes. That is light exposing darkness in a very simple way. Simply by being the good influence that you've been, people can see that. Now, in contrast, sometimes we go back to those places and we go right back into the darkness, and they're not ashamed of it. And we participate in it. And that's what Paul is alluding to here. Chris?
I most often see this verse used as part of exposing or shouting about false doctrine. Do you think that is a...
Probably not this one. There are verses where you can confront, that teach to confront false teachings and different things. I don't think this is one. This one is looking at the darkness of the world. I don't know that false teachings that arise within the church are trying to promote darkness. I simply think most of them are misunderstandings of trying to promote goodness in most cases. But I think this is about exposing the darkness of the world, the darkness of this way of life. That's what he's talking about exposing. And then go ahead.
To me, I kind of look at it as if I am being the light, then light makes all things visible.
Yeah. You're quoting Paul here. He's about to say that same thing.
Well, if I'm being the light, then I am not only exposing the darkness, but I'm also able to see it and to stay away from it.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. And if you keep reading, Paul says exactly what you just said. If you read in verse 12, he says, "For it is disgraceful even to speak of the things which are done by them in secret." Now notice verse 13. "But all things become visible when they are exposed by the light. For everything that becomes visible is light." He says, when light penetrates darkness, you can see everything. And that's exactly what you're saying. When you walk into the world walking as goodness and righteousness and truth, and it doesn't mean you walk in with your nose in the air thinking you're better than everybody, but you walk in characterized by this way of life, by way of goodness and justice and righteousness and truth. When you walk into the world with that way of life, he says you begin to see darkness for what it is. You expose those things. People can see it. When you walk into a room that has been used in filthy language and people know you and they know your character, they know your goodness and righteousness and truth, all of a sudden the darkness seems pretty shameful. I've seen that time and time again, and you'll see it in your life. And that's what he's talking about is differentiating yourself from the darkness as people of light. And then in verse 14, he gives this little poem. He says, "For this reason," it says, "awake, sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." What's interesting, and we'll leave this kind of as a cliffhanger, we're not going to really get into detail with it, but he's not quoting any scripture there. But he says, "For this reason it says." Isn't that interesting? Most people believe he's quoting probably a first century hymn or a song that was sung that was based on a couple of different scriptures, Isaiah 26:19 and Isaiah 60 verse 1. Both of those kind of allude to this concept. But it seems that he's quoting a hymn that was based on those Old Testament texts that were about, this hymn was about conversion, about awaking from sleep, about arising from the dead and allowing Christ to shine in your life. And it seems that Paul is quoting that first century song and saying, listen, awake, sleeper, you who've been asleep, you who've been in darkness, awake. And he says, rise from the dead. Isn't that what he described in chapter 2? We talked about zombies, going from death to life. He says, arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. He's going to shine his light into your life. And he quotes that song as a way of kind of a final charge to them to pull out of darkness and to pursue light. Any comments, thoughts, questions about any of that? Yep, Jack? Yep, Jack.
These are contrast verses. These are
are.
contrast teaching and contrast living. is what
Yeah,
it's
and in the next section, we don't really have time to get into it right now, but he really gets into some contrast. We actually have like 2 minutes. I'm going to write them on the board. That way you can see them. But if you look at verse, whatever the next verse is, 15, I think, notice he says, therefore, because of all of this darkness and light, he says, be careful how you walk. That word be careful means to watch out, to use your eyes, to look at your life, and be careful how you walk. And he's going to give 3 not buts. That sounds strange, but he's going to give a not and then a but. What's the first one? Walk not as what? Unwise, but as what? Wise. You keep reading. He says, walk not as unwise, but as wise. In verse 16, making the most of your time because the days are evil. We're going to talk about that next week. In verse 17, he says, so then do not be what? Foolish, but what? Understanding, discerning. And then the next one, he says, in verse 18, and do not what? Do not be drunk, but what? Well, what does he say? Filled with the Spirit. All right, these are the not buts that he's going to use to talk about all of this to kind of conclude this major section. That's what we're going to get into a little more of next week. We'll talk about some of the details of these and what he means, and then we'll kind of move into the rest of chapter 5. Any other comments, thoughts, questions about anything? Yep, go ahead, brother. Yep, go ahead, brother.
Just as a reminder.
You're good, go ahead. You're good, go ahead.
Yes, sir. Just as a reminder that this is Ephesus, this is a trade town. Like a lot of the darkness, the things, that's life to
Yeah.
a lot of
Yeah.
different folks. And to change what we're talking about is probably going to mean they're going to lose their
Yeah.
livelihood,
Yeah.
or they're not going to make
Yeah.
connections
Yeah.
that they're so. It's easy to talk about,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah,
this type of change,
Yeah.
but the sacrifice that
yeah,
it will
absolutely.
take. to be able to
That's a
do
great
that.
point. And even Jesus talked about, I didn't come to make peace, but to bring a sword and to divide father from mother and brother from sister. And those are the things these people would have dealt with. Wasn't just a simple thing like that, but it was difficult and challenging. Appreciate that thought. Thanks for your time. We will pick up there next week.